You are listening to Art Destinations, a podcast where we host fortnightly conversations with artists and thinkers living and or working on islands to see how these unique places shape imaginations. This season is set in Lutruwita, Tasmania, following on from our Venice series. Hello, my name is Sarah Rhodes, an artist based in Lutruwita, Tasmania. We are in conversation with US-born photographic artist David Stephenson, whose work is included in major collections around the world, including the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Museum of Contemporary Art in Sydney. He received an MFA from the University of New Mexico in 1982 before taking a teaching position at the University of Tasmania's School of Art. His work has consistently explored the sublime in relation to a transcendental experience of place. With an ongoing interest in human interventions in the landscape, David arrived in Tasmania in the lead up to the Franklin Dam blockade and continues to document Tasmania's contested places. He also experiments with the different ways the photographic image and different subject matters can represent time. David Stephenson is represented by Bet Gallery Hobart, Jackson Fine Art Atlanta and Budwil Schabrowski Munich. Subscribe to Art Destinations on your hosting platform so you don't miss an episode, and even leave a review. Your contribution supports us. So I'll just start by saying thank you very much, David, for coming on to Art Destinations. It's really great to have you.
It's my complete pleasure.
In the 1990s, maybe 1998, you taught me photography. I don't know if you remember.
Yeah, I remember. I knew your name, but I haven't seen you in a very long time. So
I think when I was studying under you, you were doing your Dome series, because I was looking at the dates the other day and I was thinking you were really talking to me about this sort of taxonomic or really sort of clear way of photographing things, and that sort of obviously filtered down to what I was up to. But I was looking at the dates of when you were making that work, and it was around that time. So that was quite interesting, I thought. So maybe we could just start at the beginning and find out, what brought you from the US to Tasmania?
Yeah, it was an interesting fluke of luck, really. So I was doing my Master of Fine Arts at the University of New Mexico. I'd done my undergraduate in Colorado. I was very attached to that southwestern U.S. landscape and basically photographing human alterations in that landscape. It was really my first mature project called The New Monuments, where I was photographing dams and pipelines. And, I actually got a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship in 1980 and used it to go up to Alaska and photograph the Trans-Alaska pipeline. And I was very interested in these sites and the environment were a kind of focus for controversy of the collision of different value systems. And I wasn't really interested in taking a traditional environmentalist position with them. I mean, when I was young, one of my boyhood heroes was John Muir, who's one of the earliest conservationists in America. He was the founder of the Sierra Club, and which basically came into being over a controversy over the building of the damming of a valley near Yosemite Valley called Hetch Hetchy Valley, which was kind of like another version of Yosemite that the city of San Francisco dammed as a water supply around the beginning of the 20th century. And I kind of had always thought maybe I'd even become a conservationist, otherwise known as an environmentalist now. But my paths took a different route. And I got interested in photography, but I was still interested in those controversies over land use, I think. And so back to getting to Tasmania, I was, finishing my Master of Fine Arts. I'd just done this work in Alaska, and I was looking for a teaching job to support myself as an artist photographer. Somebody showed me an ad. There was a periodical back then called After Image that was published by the Visual Studies Workshop, which was another well-known Master of Fine Arts program in the U.S. in Rochester, New York. And they had job listings, and there was this job in Tasmania. When I went into the art department at University of New Mexico the next day, there was the job application form pinned to the notice board. So it was a little bit of fate, really. I just, okay, took it. applied, sent it away. My other option, teaching job I was looking at was Notre Dame University, which is a Catholic university in Illinois, and that sounded a bit strange to me. And then I got a phone call from the head of the Tasmanian School of Art at the time, Jeff Parr, basically interviewing me over the phone about this job. And I was really of two minds. It was a long ways to go. I said I'd think about it. And then I got a phone call out of the blue from a photographer named Thomas Joshua Cooper. I don't know if you know Thomas Cooper's work. He taught in England for many years, and then he was head of photography at the Glasgow School of Art for a considerable period after that. He may have retired now, but he'd actually happened to have been in Tasmania teaching a summer school and seen my work. He'd helped review the job applications. And when he saw my work and my interest in human-altered environments, natural environments, he'd gone to UNM in a generation previous to me. And it's kind of a little bit of a UNM mafia or something out there. But he somehow got my number, probably from the job application, called me up and basically talked me into taking the job. He said I'd love it. It was, all the controversy was starting up over the Gordon Below Franklin hydroelectric project at that time. Tasmania was still kind of reeling from the debacle of the flooding of Lake Pedder with those hydro impoundments. And, Tasmania had the first green environmental party in the world, the United Tasmania Group, and it just seemed like it was kind of meant to me. So I agreed to take this job, which was a 4-year contract as a entry-level tutor. I agreed to take it for 2 years, which is about what I was willing to commit myself to. The rest is history, as they say. Here I am many decades later, still in Tasmania.
Well, amazing, confluence of events. I mean, the timing with the environmental movements is pretty lucky for you.
So when I got to Tasmania, that was really the first stuff I worked on was the hydroelectric impoundments. I took a trip out to the West Coast. I'd only been here, a few weeks and, got in the secondhand car I'd bought and drove out via Derwent Bridge and photographed the Lake King William at low levels. So it was the exposed bed of the Derwent River with a lot of dead trees and tree stumps, etc. And then drove out to the West Coast. And then when I was back teaching in the school in Hobart, I had a student named Jeff Lee. He was probably a little bit before your time. Jeff Lee had been very active in the Wilderness Society, and he was doing photography at the art school. And he was pretty knowledgeable about the whole area, and he knew all about this Murchison scheme. And we ended up managing to somehow grab a helicopter that was owned by Helicopter Resources and really under contract to the Hydroelectric Commission and getting flown into the headwaters of the Murchison River, which they'd recently moved the park boundary of Lake St. Clair National Park to accommodate this new hydroelectric dam. And getting flown into the headwaters, getting dropped off with rubber dinghies and floating down this river as the plug had been put in the dam and as the water was filling up and drowning these pristine rainforests. And it was quite an emotional experience for me. And I kind of realized at that point that I tried to be kind of very neutral about the sort of photographs I was making, but it really brought home to me the collision between these value systems that, on the one hand, you had this very development-minded Robin Gray liberal government in Tasmania at the time and a hydroelectric commission that was, almost a kind of an institution and kingdom into itself, seemed to be intent on damming every single running bit of water in Tasmania and converting it to hydroelectric power for this whole kind of what seems foolish fantasy now that somehow Tasmania could become this industrial mecca fueled by cheap hydroelectric power, meaning power subsidized by the taxpayer. That was really my first introduction to the politics, the water politics of Tasmania, the Franklin campaign. And the art school chartered a bus, drove a bunch of us out to Crotty Road to protest and get arrested. And that was when I met Ray Arnold, people like that, Peter Adams. And anyway, we all went out and I just photographed. I didn't want to get arrested. I was on a temporary visa and I didn't really want to compromise my ability to stay in Tasmania only a few months after I'd arrived. But yeah, it was an interesting time. Took the boat across Macquarie Harbor and paddled up the Gordon to the confluence with the Franklin and spent a few days in there photographing the site of where that dam was going to be built. One of the photographs I made, I think you mentioned in your questions, one that's in the collection of the MCA now, was made sort of walking up one of the survey cuts in the valley of the Gordon where this dam was going to be constructed, and then photographing looking down that survey cut. And it's an image that I'd started to use figures in these panoramas and sometimes gridded mosaic images, and this particular one had myself in it because it was a convenience. I was there photographing by myself, so I'd use a self-timer and run down and get the picture kind of as a scale reference and also as I suppose a kind of reference to the idea of being a historic witness to something. I mean, I've always seen that thing of recording history as one possible function of photography. I fully believe that I would come back at some point in time and rephotograph that same view with a dam in place. And thankfully, that didn't turn out to be the case. That dam, due to the High Court decision, was never built.
I was just thinking about, the lens that you brought coming from New Mexico and photographing in America, and then what was happening photographically here. Because at that time, Peter Dombrovskis's pictures were highly revered, and there was that real kind of more commercial wilderness, or it's become more commercial with the wilderness photography. Were you consciously wanting to take a different approach, or was that the way that your practice was already evolving in the US? Or was there already a school of photographers working like that? Like I think Jeff Parr was making pictures, wasn't he, with large format, but maybe in a more classic way?
Jeff had made fairly classical photographs down at Lake Pedder before it was dammed. There wasn't, I'm not, the expert on this of the particular period of Australian photography. Certainly that wilderness photography stream, particularly exemplified by Peter. Actually, Jeff Lee, who I'd mentioned, my student, knew Peter, and we got Peter in to talk to a class of photography students at some stage in the early 80s then. But, there was Peter's work and there was Olegus Trichonis. And so there was a kind of tradition in Tasmania of photographing the wilderness with often conservationist aims to show how beautiful it was and to preserve it. And, that is very much in the strain of a lot of American wilderness photography. People like Ansel Adams, but later color practitioners of that mode, like Elliot Porter, who photographed the Colorado River Canyon before the Glen Canyon Dam was built. It's a Sierra Club book called The Place No One Knew. And so there was a kind of tradition in America that I think probably Peter had picked up on of very beautiful large format photography of the wilderness in color, celebrating those places. And, I suppose with the kind of maybe understated political aim to preserve those places, prevent development from degrading them. Personally, I could never work in that way. I think I was just probably a bit too educated as a photographer in a way from my training and my academic training in photography, studying in art school programs. The time I studied was the sort of new topographics, and that school of social landscape photography was just, really hitting its apogee or whatever, however you might term it in the U.S. Robert Adams lived in Colorado. He didn't teach at the University of Colorado when I was a student there, but I used to go see him and show him my work. He was kind of a mentor to me, encouraging me in the sort of work I was doing. And so, for me, those sort of wilderness photographs, although they're very beautiful, in some sense, they're predicated on a lie or a falsehood. I mean, first is the idea of wilderness itself, which is very much a social construct that's based on essentially eradicating the indigenous populace of a place and then saying nobody lives there. It's unpeopled. It's the kind of lie that Australia is built on in a way of terra nullius. And, with wilderness photography, there's that kind of lie because basically there's nowhere on Earth other than Antarctica where people haven't lived. So, and then the second lie is the pretense of the photograph being this totally transparent window on the world. And we kind of got to ignore the fact that the photographer was actually there with all their equipment and all the rest of it. And it's not that I don't admire and respect what those photographers do, and I think it's very skilled, and it's beautiful work, but to me, it's a little bit one-dimensional. And the environment is much more complex than solely that it's beautiful and that we should preserve natural wild environments. I mean, I believe we should. And I think that sort of photography has a strong role to play, but I don't think it's the kind of photography I could engage in personally. And I think one of the reasons why I worked in black and white was to try to distance myself a little bit from that sort of work. Black and white itself is already an abstraction, a distancing. We see the world in color. We also see it three-dimensionally. And we see it quite differently than cameras do. But cameras have this strong reality effect, if you like it. And we tend to believe photographs to be truthful and color photographs to be even more truthful. Black and white photographs have already that little bit of abstracting distance. And, my adoption of the panorama, the composite panorama, and then the gridded panoramas, were maybe 9 or sometimes as many as 15 panels stuck together, was in a way an attempt to work against that notion that the photograph is just this transparent window on the world that doesn't alter anything. And of course, photographs always alter reality. They may strongly suggest we're looking at reality, but they're not reality.
Yeah, I think that's a good answer. I was just interested because you arrived here with a very, at that time, a unique way of looking, and that there was a definite way of seeing that was already happening. So I was just interested in, how they fitted together. You've probably answered this, but to what extent is your work political?
I don't think my work's very political at all. I always felt if you really want to engage in political change in terms of the environment, then I think activism would be, environmental activism would be a far more effective way to do that than making photographs. I mean, let's face it, art has essentially an extremely small and fairly elite audience. And I think it's pretty hard to actually effect political change through works of art. I'm not saying it never happens, but I don't think it's a very efficient path for doing that. So I've never really seen my work as being political, except in so much as, I think art is good at asking questions. I've tried to always, ask certain questions with my art about how we relate to the environment, mostly through the perspective of my personal experience of how I relate to the environment, to nature. And, human alterations to the environment are not, obviously all bad. We depend on them for a comfortable modern lifestyle. I mean, I haven't retreated to a subsistence existence, living in a handmade cabin in the woods, hunting all my own food and being off the grid or anything like that. So, particularly as a photographer where you're immersed in a kind of technology to some extent, I'm not going to deny all that or think that everything the humans do to the environment is bad. But I just don't know whether my photographs are really a particularly good way to address those things. And the other thing I'd say is that, I think political art can, not always, but it can be a little bit narrow in its vision and, a bit didactic. And, I've always thought my work was as much about photography itself as a medium and as it is about its subject, the theoretical subject of the world. I think I've explored a lot of sort of ways of getting at some of these same ideas, but if I could bring it down to, defining things, it would be, our place in the world as humans, how photography could maybe look at that, ask questions about it, and also comment on itself, because it's such an incredibly dominating medium now in terms of how we see everything.
Well, that's right. I mean, photography is shifting as well so much in terms of the art photography compared with what it was. It's evolving, I guess, in reaction to the ubiquity of the phone.
Yeah, it's quite interesting, isn't it? With digital photography, it's so easy to make photographs now, really high quality photographs just with your phone, as you mentioned. And now there's been this whole sort of resurgence of interest in, film and analog photography. And, it's I find it slightly amusing on some level, but I can understand why people are interested in it. And probably for the same reason that I am. I mean, I've never really stopped doing analog photography, and I've done a lot of digital photography as well. But there's something about the slowness of the analog process and the amount of time that, as an artist, you invest in the image, that it gives you a kind of commitment and attachment to the image that's not always there with the digital image.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think as well, the actual, because you're slower, you're more mindful about the making of it, whereas with digital you can be a bit more rushed. And so I would never say there's more soulfulness overall, but sometimes if you're taking the same picture, you can rush through a bit with the digital. With the analog, it slows you down so you can connect deeply, I think. I mean, obviously, one's not better than the other, but there is that factor.
I think digital photography has a lot to do with editing, whereas, when you're working with a large format view camera, for instance, and it's quite time consuming, which is a way I still work a lot. And, it's not inexpensive. You don't just fire off shot after shot. You tend to be quite careful about the images you make. So the editing process tends to take place before you even set up the camera. I wander around a lot, and I actually take a lot of photos with my phone to try to figure out viewpoints and angles of view and that kind of thing. And then sometimes I'll wander around with a medium format digital camera and take a lot of photographs. And I can't say that, it's not like I get a better quality image out of the large format view camera. I get a different sort of image, and I can do things with the film image that I can't do with a digital camera, like very long exposures and so on and so forth. So I can do certain things with it. And I've tended to, in more recent projects working on film, tended to do things that I can't really do with a digital camera. And that's one reason why I'm using that tool. But I also have to say, I kind of just I still have an attachment to the process of setting up the camera, getting under the dark cloth, framing the image. I just enjoy it, and it's not logical. It's not like I get a better quality image most of the time. I just enjoy it and have more attachment to the image.
It's nice talking to a photographer who actually loves, the whole spectrum of photography. That's quite lovely. So at the beginning, we were talking about you going to Europe and making the pictures of the domes. So at that time, you were making these pictures in the landscape in Tasmania, and you've continued to do that. So you've had several projects running at the same time. The dome pictures is quite a shift. Is there an idea that is in parallel, or are they separate ideas?
I think they're related. When I moved to Tasmania, I was essentially working with very descriptive approach to photography. making these large format view camera images, very detailed, fairly modestly scaled prints now. They kind of got bigger in those first years in Tasmania. And then I sort of, to put this, I think I just got a bit fed up with all that detail. That's the simplest way to describe it. I think one of the things was I'd always been interested in abstract painting and this kind of yearning in a certain tradition of abstract painting, abstract expressionism of the more geometric type. I'm thinking about people like Barnett Newman, Agnes Martin, who are really, I think, in their work, Rothko to some extent, striving to represent some kind of experience of transcendence. One of Barnett Newman's early large-scale, hard-edge abstract paintings is called The Sublime Is Now. Partially through my pretty academic MFA at New Mexico. In New Mexico, you had to write essentially a master's level art history thesis as part of the MFA and, presumably history of photography. And my thesis, it's called a dissertation. It was on 19th century American landscape photography, primarily of the railroad, and the attempt to reconcile a kind of vision of natural grandeur exemplified by these traditions of the natural sublime that go back to the 18th century with this kind of new industrialization that the railroad was a prime exemplar of. And the Transcontinental Railroad in the U.S., that was a very political act, the building of that railroad. It was to unite the East Coast with the West Coast because after the Civil War, there was a strong fear that California would secede from the Union. And so the railroad was seen as a way of uniting the two coasts. And they hired, numerous photographers to document that, some very interesting photographers. Some of them were Civil War photographers. But one of the things you see in a lot of that work are stereographs, which were interesting in terms of dealing with the three-dimensional spaces like tunnels and road cuts. And stereography is something I've returned to periodically in my work. And the other thing is panoramas. And, a lot of the 19th century photographers worked on panoramas, multi-pane panoramas. And I think a lot of it is this attempt to deal with this grand space. And space is one of the things that the sublime usually draws on, the experience of the sublime, which I'm not going to give you an academic treatise on the sublime, but we could just kind of summarize it as an experience of awe, of things that are great in space, or a feeling of, like the night sky, knowing the universe is huge, vast, or a large landscape space, and knowing that they're vast, not only in terms of space, but in terms of time. And time is often talked about because in, the 19th century, the writings on the sublime in the 19th century are all about geology. Geology was a new science in the 19th century, and it was continually expanding the age of the Earth. Like, hey, the Earth wasn't created 5,000 years ago by the Lord. No, it was a bit older than that. First it was thousands, then millions of years, then, billions of years. And geology, paleontology, they were at the forefront of things that were in real contradiction to the Christian worldview. And so time is a big element of thought about the sublime, as well as space. And to get back to your question about the dome, so I started making these much more reductive images. I sort of had this idea that my photographs were just too descriptive, and people would always go, like, where is that? What mountain is that? Or what canyon is that? And so I somehow thought, probably misguidedly, but it was my thinking at the time, that if I emptied out that detail and made the images emptier, without those sort of specificities of place, I could maybe direct the viewer's attention to these ideas about the sublime, about just an experience of transcendence or awe. The sublime is all about losing oneself in that space and time, feeling oneself very small and diminished, but there's a kind of liberation in that because you feel connected with that greater sense, which, for 19th century people was probably seen in very Christian terms. Not so much for me, because I'm not religious in that sense. My impulse behind emptying the images out of detail was, a little bit like the impulse of Rothko's paintings or whatever, creating these kind of empty voids. And so one of the things that I started doing was experimenting with the pinhole apertures on my view camera. That was a way of like eliminating detail. And eventually, ended up, basically just photographing these horizons at sea. This is around 1989. And just getting these kind of two tones of gray with this sort of soft horizon, because one of the things the pinhole exposure allowed me to do was slow the exposure down to 5 or 10 minutes instead of just this fraction of a second, like with a typical lens-based image. And I've always been interested in that thing of duration, because my sense of an experience of the sublime in nature, it's always about time. It's never about anything instant. It's about being in a place for a while and letting it seep into you and letting you seep into the place. And I think that was one of the impulses behind the panoramas and these complex gridded photographs that I didn't just make one exposure. I made like 15 exposures, kind of mapping out this environment surrounding me. And it was partially just a logical, functional solution to trying to deal with a space that's all around you. But it's also about that sense of duration. And so the pinhole photographs fulfilled that desire to explore a sense of duration in the image to some extent. And, I can remember one of the pinhole images I made was up at Freycinet, and I think it was probably a 10-minute exposure and of this large rock like hanging over the ocean. And I started the exposure, and then I went out and sat on the rock, and then I went back and stopped the exposure. And so there's this kind of transparent version of myself sitting on this tiny figure, sitting on this rock, and you can see the rest of the landscape through me. And to me, that was a kind of great metaphor for like having that sort of experience of the sublime or of transcendence, when the kind of boundaries between the self and everything outside of the self are, our kind of physical, our fictional construction of us being a discrete self start to dissolve. And that's when you have an experience of transcendence or, enlightenment, or, there's a lot of different terms for, I think, trying to get at the same kind of thing of like shutting off or somehow stepping outside of the ego and the boundaries we've built with our kind of narratives and stories of, who we are, etc., as sort of discrete beings. Now, and I just to finish that line of thought with the pinhole images, I kind of got rid of the pinhole after a while, but I kept the long exposures. So I was using neutral density filters to slow exposures down to 5-10 minutes, mostly photographing the sky. And it was kind of very self-conscious reenactment of Alfred Stieglitz's Equivalence series. I think for similar reasons, he got frustrated with the descriptive readings of the photograph, and he wanted photographs that sort of spoke of emotional states. And so he thought if he photographed clouds, which were quite abstract, he could somehow bypass that descriptive thing. And I guess I thought, maybe I could do clouds in this different way with these very long exposures where they were rendered as blurs, or photographing moving water. I'm giving you a little bit of background to going to Europe because it's not so straightforward. But in 1990, I found out I was going to get sent to Antarctica with the Antarctic Division, which is something I've been trying to do for a few years. They didn't have a formal fellowship program at that time, but I've been trying to get a berth to go down and photograph. And I found out I was going to go in very early 1991. So I had this idea in 1990. I'm going to do this kind of circumnavigation of the globe. Only somebody how old was I? 35 then, could have this kind of grandiose notion of, a giant global project. I thought I'll go to north of the Arctic Circle and south of the Antarctic Circle in 1 year. And I did this project called VAST. And one of the things I did with the northern pictures, I went up to like Lofoten, Norway, and Abisko, Sweden, doing these really long exposures of the sea or clouds moving over mountains. And then when I went to Antarctica, everything was frozen. Nothing was really moving. So I could get rid of the long exposures because it was, time was stopped and this other sort of way. But, all about time. And I guess to what I'm saying was all these things fed into me then going to Europe. And, I think what happened was I did a little trip around Italy with my partner, Anne, before I started the residency. We went to the Pantheon in Rome. Have you been to the Pantheon in Rome?
I went last year and I know exactly I've got the view in my mind.
So it's sometimes described as the world's greatest building for good reason. And as soon as I went into the Pantheon, I had this kind of deja vu from the first time I went into the Pantheon, which would have been probably 10 years earlier, running through this thunderstorm in the streets of Rome, trying to find the Pantheon. Going into the Pantheon, it was still raining, but the sun had come out, and there was just this calm of rain coming down through the open oculus, illuminated by the sun. It was like, wow, you don't need to be on drugs to have this sort of experience. So, it was incredible. And when I went back to the Pantheon, that was when I just conceived the Dome Project. Like, this is amazing because this building is the experience I have in the environment. This is what these sorts of buildings are trying to create in the viewer, this experience of awe. And, the Pantheon, which is pre-Christian, even though it's now a Christian church, it's a Roman building, churches are all about that. I mean, I've never had, a lot of time for Catholicism, but I can definitely appreciate the theatrics of Catholic churches and, what they do to you when you go into those spaces. They're incredible. And, domes are very interesting structures. They're circular. We have a very great affinity with them. They're like the human eye. The oculus is often a feature of domes. It's like the pupil of the eye. We really connect with them in a really profound way. There's a lot of theories about, how the origins of the dome, that it goes back to, domical early dwellings of yurts or skins pulled over, bent wood frames and all. And I don't really know about any of that. All I can say is I think we connect with that form very strongly. And partially, I think it's because it's how we experience the sky as a kind of dome over us. And, often the decoration in domes is to reproduce some sense of the sky, the heavens, because that's like where God lives, of course, and that sort of thing. But, I think, regardless of what your religious orientation, they're buildings we really connect with. And I think we connect with them in the way of that sense and experience of the sublime or transcendence or whatever. So for me, that Dome Project is totally coalesced with that one visit. And I spent 3 months. And then, as I said earlier, another 10 years photographing domes because it's a kind of collection, if you like. And I got very fascinated with how the form changes over time across geography. And one of the things I did shortly after that initial Italian residency in 93 was I started photographing the night sky in 1995. And, I'd always made night photographs in the landscape. Some of my panoramas from the late 80s in Tasmania were night panoramas. Partially about, it's just an amazing time to be out in the environment at night. It's a kind of totally different sense of it. And also, things look quite different because the Earth's spinning. So stars are not rendered as points of light. They're rendered as lines or arcs more accurately. And so I got quite interested in 95, returning to the night sky and just looking at the sky. And I think that was really the influence of the Dome Project, where domes are often a recreation of the sky. And then I'd photograph the clouds around 1990, 91. So actually up to 93 because I did quite a few in Italy. So looking at the sky again, but at night. And I quickly got on to, again, coming from my interest in that tradition of abstract painting. One of the things I was very interested in painting was minimalism, the work of people like Robert Ryman and his just white paintings. He did nothing but white paintings for decades. They're all very different. But also the post-minimalist artists and conceptual artists like Saul LeWitt. And I'd read Yeah, I read some interesting essays at the time by people like Robert Pincus Witten about work by Solowitz, essentially based on a pre-executive decision. He talks about Richard Serra's work in the same way. Richard Serra did this series of works, which are in museums all over the world, these splatter works, where he'd throw molten lead against a wall, or like the junction of the wall and the floor, and then it would form in this shape. And that shape was kind of determined really by the geometry of the wall and the size of the lead. But it was all about having this plan beforehand of what you do, and then the work as a result of the plan. Solowitz work, they're based on a set of rules or algorithms, a set of instructions, divide a wall into 4 quadrants, and each quadrant create a diagonal line going from upper left to lower right, so on and so forth. And then anybody can execute the work. So fairly quickly with the star pictures, I got really interested in this idea of the pre-executive decision and making images based on really a set of rules. And I really didn't know, what the thing looked like was going to be a result of those rules. And the first rules were very simple. I'd photograph a constellation like the Southern Cross, Crux, for, 5 minutes, and then rotate the camera 90 degrees, make another exposure on top of that for 5 minutes. And then the rules got more and more complex. One of the things that was also behind this thing is the idea of multiple exposures, wanting to rebel a little bit against that notion of the photograph as a straight window on the world and see what photography could do. And a photographer who I'd always really admired was Harry Callahan. And Callahan was an American photographer who was very active in the 50s through the 70s. He was a very influential teacher at the Rhode Island School of Design. He represented the U.S. at the Venice Biennale one year as one of the very few photographers to ever do that. He was a very interesting photographer who was always very experimental in his approach. And back in probably the 60s, maybe even the 50s, he did a lot of multiple exposure work. And some of them were just done by making a photograph of, like, say, a city skyline, and then inverting the camera and re-exposing it with the same photograph. So the skyline is like just a skyline surrounded by this white void. And I thought, wow, that's fascinating. And I thought, I bet I could do that with the stars and just start layering exposures up of light on this black field. And that's really where the star drawings came from, those two impulses, the pre-executive decision of a set of rules and the idea of multiple exposures. Multiple exposures in cameras often just look like a mess, an unintelligible mess, but with no formal structure. But with that black field, I didn't really have all that interference. So eventually I started working in color, on color transparency, and I did a number of different things. Sometimes I do intermittent exposures where I'd do like a half an hour exposure, but I take the lens cap off for a minute and then I put it back on for a minute. So I'd have like a series of dots or dashes. And then I do these complicated multiple exposures where sometimes I do as many as 72 exposures on the same frame, rotating the camera, maybe 5 degrees between each exposure. But yeah, the point is I could give somebody instructions on how to make that photograph because it was really based on a rule of pointing the camera at a certain point in the sky and then doing this action. And I was very active with those in 95, 96. And I think, a lot of my work's often been about that back and forth between description and abstraction, or testing the boundaries of description, because in some ways the star photographs are also highly descriptive. And one of the things that I found most interesting about photographing stars is the whole way in which you think about time with them. Stars, the closest one's 4.3 light years away. That's Alpha Centauri, one of the pointer stars. And, that means the light takes over 4 years to reach us. Many of the stars, the light takes thousands, tens of thousands of years to reach us. So the star we see is actually ancient light. We're looking back into distant prehistory, sometimes before humans even walked on the earth. That's like fascinating. That totally blows your mind about time and our place in time and our importance as humans. And, it's another thread of my interest in geology. When you photograph a landscape where you see the rocks and the mountains, the spine of the earth sticking up, you're also looking back into ancient time. The bones of the earth, my friend Rick Dingus described it as. But there's something really fascinating about that often we lose track of, I think, in our day-to-day existence where, everything's really important. What happened yesterday, what's going to happen tomorrow. Often not so much importance on right now, unfortunately, which is, I think, what we could concentrate on a bit more. And I think it's one of the things I love about making art is that it really forces you into this particular moment in time where you just engage with that moment. So with the stars, though, it's really interesting. We're geology, you're in this one moment, but then you're also looking back into this very, very distant moment and then layering those moments on top of each other, and all the different stars are obviously different moments because they're different distances away. It's quite fascinating and how it expands our idea about what time is and what our place is in it.
So at the beginning, you were talking about, when we were talking about the landscapes in Tasmania, the Murchison Dam and places like that, and you were thinking about, and even with the rock, you were putting yourself in there and you were immersing yourself. So when you apply rules to the night sky images, are you thinking about immersion of yourself, or is it just the fact that you're there making the picture that's enough? If you're creating a set of rules that you could give to someone else to make under your name, essentially, then how does that work?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I'm sure those star pictures have lots of paradoxes in them. I've given you an explanation of them, but, now I'm thinking, yeah, why do I do all that? But, now I think for me, it's always about my experience. And that's what's driving it. And also, I've always been interested in experimenting, just seeing what happens. And I love photographs where you don't really know what it's going to look like. And it's probably one of the things I dislike about digital photography generally is, you got that instant, just review it. Oh, that's what it looks like. Whereas with film, you got to wait. You got to wait until you get home and you process the film, and then it looks better than you thought or worse than you thought, or it's a total disaster. It didn't work out at all because you made a mistake. There's lots of things that can go wrong, and I enjoy that part of it. And I think with the star photographs particularly, and I think to some extent those gridded photographs in the Tasmanian landscape, it's that you don't, and the long exposures in general, you don't really know what it's going to look like until you get back. And so I guess I'm always driven by the experience I'm having of the environment. But, really the photograph is not really an analog for that. The photograph's about something else because it's also about photography itself. And it doesn't really in any way, shape, or form reproduce that experience you had in the environment. It might point to it in some way, but it doesn't reproduce it. And I don't think I've ever made work that created an experience of the sublime for a viewer or anything like that. But it kind of points to that experience.
I just want to say one thing actually about the night sky. In some ways, the whole point that it takes the self out of it is the point of the work in many ways, isn't it? Because it just makes you realize the universe is so much bigger than any of us.
It is. I kept going back to those star pictures. I did them in 95, 96. I returned to them 10 years later. This is like me, totally, to return to an idea and think, I think I could do something else with this. I started taking my 8x10 view camera up to Central Australia and making photographs that either took all night or sometimes 2 nights, where I built up these long exposures over successive nights. And I did 2, for me, fairly successful works in that time. I did one work in 2005 where I remember how this worked. I've sort of photographed for an all-night exposure, and then the next night I rotated the camera a bit and photographed again all night. And then I started a second sheet of film on the third and fourth day for a second sheet. And I essentially I think I rotated 45 degrees each time. And in any effect, I ended up with this 4-panel panorama that mapped out the entire night sky, but in this weird kind of overlapped way. And then I did another work in 2006, sort of similar, but I did 3 exposures in each night. The point was, I hadn't completely let go of the stars. I returned 10 years later. I returned again in 2009, did another series in far northern Western Australia, Northwest Cape. I mean, the reason I went to these places is working in Tasmania and trying to do night photographs. I just had so many problems with condensation on the lens and not having consistent clear nights. So that's why I went to the desert.
Well, my next question was, does place have an influence on the making of those pictures?
It does, yeah, because it'd be quite amazing being out somewhere in the outback desert photographing all night. And not that I necessarily stayed up all night. I'd set an alarm to get up in 3 hours and move the camera or whatever, because it's pretty funny. I've done a lot of night work because I am so totally not a night owl. I'm what they call a super early chronotype. I'm always up by 5 a.m. and to bed at 9 p.m. And I don't say that because it's like some sense of moral superiority or virtue or anything. It's just the way I am. So for me to stay up at night and make photographs, I really have to be dedicated to the cause completely of making the photographs.
You've been talking all the way through about exploring the sublime and the transcendental experience of being in a place. And I went to the Hiroshi Sugimoto show at the MCA recently when it was on. And he is really exploring similar ideas of time. I'm not so sure about the sublime, but have you ever thought of a parallel between the two of your works?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mentioned before I was doing those pinhole photographs around 88, 89, and I trying to empty the image out, and I ended up with these photographs of horizons at sea. And I didn't really, Sugimoto was not well known at that time. I didn't know of that work at all, but I was showing some work to the curator of photography at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York at the time, Maria Morris Homburg. And she was looking at my horizons and seeing, and says, "Oh, do you know this work?" And she pulled out this catalog from Sonnabend or somewhere of Sugimoto's seascapes. I was like, wow, those are amazing. And that was pretty much, I sort of stopped doing photographs of the horizon horizon at sea bisecting the frame. And not to say that I didn't do any more photographs of the sea or the horizon, but I just thought, this guy's done this really well. And, there's not much point in me walking in those footsteps. But Sugimoto, so there is that connection. What I've read of Sugimoto, I'm not an expert on his work, but I didn't see the MCA show, but I have seen most of those projects at one time or another in my travels. What I've read about him, he never really talks about the sublime. He talks about, with the seascapes, his impetus for those being the notion of photographing a part of the earth that looks the same as it did to ancient peoples. That's always this kind of timeless, that's always looked the same, always was, always shall be, or whatever. And that's not something I ever thought about in that way. I never really thought about that connection, thinking about the ocean in that way, but it makes total sense. For me, it was always just about that experience of immense space and this feeling of kind of, I guess, timelessness in a way, which I think is probably what he's getting at with that notion of photographing something. But, obviously with subsequent bodies of work, with the movie theaters, which are also one of his earliest projects where he photographs a movie theater and the duration of a film's projected on the screen for the whole movie. So you just get this white void. And, I think there is this sense in those of almost a transcendent space, although he's never really talked about it in those terms. He talks about, I think his work for me, it's very much about experimenting with what photography is and its reality effect. He talks about that, the way the photograph makes everything real. So with the dioramas or the wax portraits, that somehow photographing it makes it more real than it actually was when you saw it in the museum. And that's an interesting aspect of it. I think that the time thing is probably the connection between my work and Sugimoto's, who, I admire very much. He's an amazing artist.
Okay, that's a good answer. You won the Hadley's Art Prize a couple of years ago with your time slice image. So would you talk a little bit about that, because that's quite a departure from the where you started?
It's interesting. It is and it isn't. Okay, so I've always been interested in time-lapse photography. And, one of the early projects I did when I was a grad student in New Mexico is I did a film, a Super 8 film, shooting single frames and moving through the environment. So you get this huge time compression when you then run it at normal speed. And then I did something similar. I remember doing this early work when I was in Tasmania, going on a bushwalk in walls of Jerusalem with a couple of students, and doing a work where I walked around. There's a mountain you can walk around on the walls of Jerusalem. I can't remember the name of it, but where I make a photograph every 100 meters as I walked around this mountain and circumnavigated this mountain, and then made all these little prints. And then I did it as a flick book, where you could flick through it and watch the mountain rotate. So it's another kind of temporal and also spatial compression in a sense. When I was working on the Light Cities project, I also started in places like Singapore and Shanghai shooting these time lapses, which I just did as conventional time-lapse videos. This is probably around, as I said, 2012, 2013. And then Martin Walsh was a student of mine at the art school. He'd been an undergraduate and then done honors, and then he was back doing a PhD. And in his PhD, which I supervised, he'd done a lot of work up at Lake King William. He did a lot of things that were not photographic at all, say doing GPS tracks of walking through the environment and then rendering those as video animations. So he had some shared interests in rendering, being in the environment, also working at Lake King William. Sometime around that period when I was photographing on the Light Cities project, finishing that up and doing these time lapses, I thought, Martin, maybe you and I can work together, initially at Lake King William. And one of the issues is partially driven by the university. Sadly, even this was quite a long time ago. I think it's even worse now, but there was a lot of pressure to bring in external research funding. And at the time, my role at the university was research coordinator for the art, visual and creative arts or whatever. So I kind of felt like, having these workshops, I'd applied for quite a few Australian Research Council grants, and we had an early one, small one back in probably about 1995, which is the thing I actually did the star drawings as part of that project. It was called Imagine Nature and had Ray Arnold and Anne MacDonald and Lee Hava working on it. And we all kind of did our individual thing. But then I'd put in subsequent Australian Research Council projects where I tried to kind of get some funding up for, say, people working around the issue of representing time in photography, but with people doing individual projects, like individual artists. Artists mostly work individually. That's been the general paradigm. And, it became clear that I wasn't going to get funding up for something that was that unfocused. It couldn't just be around a concept. So I came up with this idea that, Martin and I initially could work together at Lake King William and do something around that site and representing a complex environment like that. It's the original river valley of the Derwent, which would have been a beautiful river valley flowing out of Lake St. Clair and then probably meandering through Buttonglass Plains, probably created through Aboriginal fire regimes, fringed with eucalypt forests. And then sometime in the 60s, I think, as part of the Derwent hydroelectric scheme, there's in-stream impoundments all down the Derwent. They go back to probably the 40s and Tasmania's dream of cheap hydroelectric power. And there's a whole interesting history, but the King William Dam was part of that, the Butler's Gorge Dam. What it did is it totally flooded that river valley. But King William's got a huge fluctuation between low water levels and high levels. At high levels, when you get to Derwent Bridge, the water backs up almost to Derwent Bridge, and it just looks like this vast lake. It's got a few dead trees in it, but so what? And then at low levels, you can't even see the lake. It is so far receded down towards Butler's Gorge that you just see this vast barren plain of tree stumps and dead trees that it looks like the battlefield of the Somme. You can't imagine a more devastated apocalyptic environment. So it's a really interesting environment that changes so much seasonally. When Martin and I started talking, we were both interested in that aspect of it. And hey, maybe working as a team, we can bring in some of this grant funding that I felt under a lot of pressure to try to bring into the university. And so we initially got like a seeding grant or two from the university to work on Lake King William. And from that grew the Derwent Project, which was about representing the whole watershed of the Derwent, which has all these dams on it. It's a very complex environment, trying to represent how it changes over time, seasonally, at different water levels. And so that's where the Derwent Project came from. We were talking about how we could sort of maybe get some sort of data visualization into our photographs. And then Martin had showed me this PhotoViz book because we're trying to think of how we maybe incorporate some data into these videos of meteorological data. We didn't really know, but, we were trying to make it kind of sexy, data-driven, not just plain old boring photography and video. How do we represent this complex environment by bringing in other kinds of data? And in this PhotoViz book was a number of photographers doing these time slice photographs. One of them was this guy, Richard Silver, who, as far as I can tell, maybe was one of the first people to do this, of photographing the same scene, but making a whole lot of photographs, probably shooting a time-lapse sequence over a period of time, and then doing a series of slices where you kind of, say you imagine you divide the frame into 10 slices, and the first slice is, 10 minutes before the next slice, which is 10 minutes later, the third slice is 10 minutes later, and so on. And so you map out how time plays out across this time with this series of slices in this time slice photograph, which is what he called it. And I think he actually did a little book back around 2007 called Time Slice or something. Anyway, Martin showed me these pictures and thought, oh yeah, that's interesting. And then a little while later, we'd had this idea we were going to do time lapses of the watershed over this period of time. We eventually got this 3-year funding that we would try to at least capture 2 years of the environment changing over this time. And so our initial thing was we were just going to shoot our time lapses and just do time lapse videos of them, which is what we started doing. And then at some point, Martin had this idea that, hey, we could do time slices of these time lapse sequences, and then we could animate those and get these kind of time slice videos. And, Martin's sort of computer oriented. He likes programming. And he did some programming and built a program that could do these multiple time slice photographs from any time lapse sequence. So you'd have 1,000 time-lapse photographs. And from that, you could create 1,000 time-slice photographs. And then you just put those, you animate those by, putting them in, there's a lot of different ways you can animate those, but the easiest way is just in something like QuickTime. And you create a video of the time slices, so you get kind of this moving time slice. So we tried them in different ways. And meanwhile, I kept shooting individual time-lapse sequences with a high-resolution camera out in the environment because I was actually kind of more interested in the still time slice. Just the time slice photographs are a little bit hard to understand, but, you can kind of understand that. Once they're in a video animation, it's tougher. But in the end, working collaboratively with somebody, you can't always have it your own way. I think you just got to realize there's a give and take. And, Martin was very keen on these time-slice videos because he'd invented them. I was like, yeah, okay, we'll do that. And in the Derwent exhibition at the TMAG, when I look back of the 3 works we did in that project, I really like the time slice videos the least. But I still was very interested in the still images, which I continued to make from those early ones I'd done in Singapore and Shanghai. By that time, I'd started working with, high resolution, just a full frame DSLR and shooting these normally 2 or 3 day sequences. When I look back on them, they're kind of like the star photographs too. There's these intervals of time layered on top of each other. In the case of the star photographs, they use the movement of time. So it's clearly something I've always found fascinating, this interest in duration of time, intervals of time, being in the environment for a period of time. Normally with the time-lapse sequences, I'd just set up my camera and then leave it for a few days, try to set it up somewhere where it wasn't going to get disturbed or stolen. And then, you end up with all these files and you spend days experimenting with them. And, now, I've sort of pretty much stopped this work. After a while, I made some successful images with them. Mostly the ones I ended up working on were tracking the moon rising or setting or the sun rising or setting across the sky. And, the Hadley's picture, that's at our family shack at Brady's Lake, which is coincidentally where I'd located one of the Derwent Project fixed cameras because it was a place that was relatively less chance of vandalism and it was a place I could service regularly. So even after we took this camera down, I love this wattle tree because it's just this grand old huge wattle. I don't know how much longer it is for this world, but it, looks out over the lake and it sees the days coming and going, the moon rising, the sun rising, it's snowing, the snow melting, all things that we had observed in the Derwent videos. So I just continued to photograph this tree. I've photographed it with a view camera, and I've done probably 6 time-lapse sequences of that tree, and I guess I was quite attached to it. That Hadley's Prize was partially about the tree because I've always been interested in trees, and, as I think, I can't remember whether you mentioned it in your questions, but from time to time, I've done projects looking at trees. I did a drown series of trees and hydroelectric impoundments around 2001. I did the Bone Country series quite recently, which was trees and dead bones. But I also did that show at BET, Survivors, of solarized images of mostly dead trees 3 or 4 years ago. So the Hadley's Prize was about those. There's, I guess, a few things going on. I've been doing the time slices, trying to deal with this iteration of time, duration of time, being in an environment for a period of time, and the notion of the tree often being of much longer life than us, being in this environment for a long period of time, being kind of grounded in that space. So those things kind of came together in that image. That's where the time slice stuff came from, the Richard Silver work, the videos that Martin and I did for the Derwent Project, and then just continuing to do those, but I've largely left them behind and gone back to just doing very long exposures with the view camera.
Well, I was just thinking that, after doing all that editing, you'd be craving to get back in the darkroom, having to choose between 8,000 images. You'd be like, just give me that darkroom with that one choice.
Yeah, that's part of it. Look, I think with the time slice images, one of the things I find, and I think it was the problem I have with them, the ones we showed in the Darwin project, and why I've lost interest in the still ones is, they interrupt the window so much. It's like a screen you're looking through. With the video animations, I think it's almost like an unintelligible screen. But even with the still images, I think I talked a little bit about the transparent window and kind of liking to disrupt that. And I think the mosaic panoramas from the late 80s do that. But the disruption is also kind of an annoyance in some ways, and it's like a filter you're trying to look through. And I think that's why I've gotten tired of the time slice images. It's just a little bit too much I want something slightly more seamless. So I'd like to talk about duration and time, but possibly in a way that's not such an interruption. And so, more recently I've been doing like 3 and 4 hour exposures with a view camera, because it's all kind of melded together.
Interesting.
But, same impulse, but just approaching it with a different formal approach. And so, yeah, I've hardly been doing any of those time slices. Stopped doing them probably a year or 2 ago.
You've been very generous going through your career, essentially. I was interested in knowing the key moments, but I sort of hadn't really thought when I asked you the questions that we would be going through your entire career. So thank you for your time.
Oh, you got me talking and I don't know when to stop.
I loved it. It was really, I loved that conversation. So thank you so much for coming along.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate your interest in my work.
It was nice to listen to you talking about, playing with photography for the sake of photography and experimenting with what it can do technically, I suppose, with the panoramas and the multi-panels and the time slice. But then also the thing that I'm probably the most interested in is that the immersiveness or the sublime or that feeling, And I was also interested in the Rothko link because there's that idea when you abstract something and you take something out, you lose the specificity of something. And then, when you do that, it becomes something else, I guess. It becomes more of a feeling rather than a detail, and then finding that balance. It's an interesting thing to think about.
I think it's always like a dialogue, isn't it? And it goes back and forth, and there's no answer or correct answer, but, they're all different ways to explore, for me, about really my relationship to existing. Trying to feel connected. And I think photography is a way that allows me to do that, to explore that, really.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much, David. I'll stop recording. Thank you for listening to this conversation with David Stephenson. Be reminded about the next episode of Art Destinations Tasmania by subscribing to our fortnightly newsletter on our website, artdestinations.org. I am your host, Sarah Rhodes. Ciao for now.